Hello again, YouTube. Today we're going to take OpenVDB data created using XParticles 4 Explosia FX and render out a photorealistic explosion using Redshift. Take a look. This tutorial assumes that you know how to export OpenVDB data from XParticles 4, or at least that you have some OpenVDB data exported from XParticles 4. If you don't have any OpenVDB data or don't know how to export it, I suggest going back to my last video where I explained how to do this process in Octane. I explained how to export the data from XParticles in that tutorial, so if you go back and just watch, say, the first 5, maybe 6 minutes of that tutorial, you should have a pretty good idea. Now, if you have OpenVDB data and you're ready to go, let's get started. Here we are in Cinema 4D, and we're basically where I would have left off at like the 5-minute mark from the last tutorial. I've got my Explosia FX object here with some sweet smoke going up in the air, and I've cached out this data to a series of OpenVDB files. So before we get started trying to make all of this work, we just want to turn the lights on. So I'm going to go ahead and create an area light here. And I'm going to want to target this just to make things simple, so I'll create a null. And because I am talking to the camera, I'll go ahead and name this. And I'm going to use it for the focus as well as the light target, so I'll go ahead and call it center of attention. And then we need to create a target and drop our center of attention in there. And let's go ahead and move the center of attention right around there. I'm wanting it to kind of maybe a little bit higher. Over. That's about right. Okay, so now we can take our light, and I'll go ahead and do my 4 up. Just bring this over here. Always come up a little bit higher. Something like this. And if we come at it from the side, we're going to get harder shadows. So I'll go ahead and set this to about 30, maybe 35 by 35. You'll have to bring up the intensity. Another thing that I like to do here is set one light on either side and have a little bit of a difference in color temperature. So we'll set this one to 5500 Kelvin, and then we'll duplicate it, bring it over to here, maybe spread them out even a little bit more. And we'll call this cool light, and this will be our warm light. Great, and we'll make this, say, 3600. Cool. So now we can go ahead and bring in our IPR and just take a look at what we have so far. And as you can see, we basically have nothing. I mean, we've got our lights here, so that's great. But we're missing an explosion. And that's because we haven't even brought our, as far as Redshift is aware, we don't even have an explosion. So we're going to need to bring in a Redshift volume object. And we'll need to essentially tell Redshift where our OpenVDB data is, and we'll do that using this path here. So we'll open up Finder, and we'll just grab the first volume file here. And Redshift is actually pretty smart. Unlike Octane, bringing in the entire animation is pretty simple. Actually, we'll select simple, and no pun intended there, I promise. And we know that, well, let's just do detect frame, and it knows how many frames we have, which is great. And so now we still don't see anything. Let's go ahead and turn off our 4 up view here. We still don't see anything, and that's because our volume is here, but it doesn't have a material. So now we need to create a Redshift volume material. There's a lot of build-up here. This better be good. So we'll open up our Redshift volume shader. We just added it to our Redshift volume. We still don't see anything. That's because it's not hooked up to a channel. So when you export out of XParticles, you're going to export various channels. If we select EFX format here, we can see fuel, smoke, temperature. We could have exported velocity, but we didn't. UVW and color. We didn't export these three, but we know that when it comes to these channels here, we have these three options: fuel, density, and heat. So for our smoke, we're going to go ahead and set this to density. And smoke is basically controlled by scatter and absorption. So now we've got something, but it's basically pure black. And there are a number of different reasons for that, but one of them is that our light sources are not affecting our smoke. So we have to select these two light sources here. Let's bring them down here. And we're going to need to come to the volume tab and set the contribution scale to something nice and low like 0.1. And now we start to see a little bit of detail in this smoke, which is great. I'm going to bring up the scatter coefficient, which basically adds lightness, until it looks about right to me. That's good, but the smoke is looking a little bit dense. And I mean that in the kindest way possible. So I'm going to come in here, and the easiest way to thin out your smoke a little bit is to grab this old max and just start bringing it down. And as you can see, as I adjust this slider, the more I adjust it, the less dense the smoke gets. So I'm going to bring it to something like that. That looks pretty good. And the other thing we can do is actually, we have this contribution scale. I'm going to go ahead and let this affect the smoke just a little bit more. There we go. That's looking pretty good. Let's make this window a little bigger. All right, so this slider here for old max will also help you if you're starting to notice that the smoke is a little bit blocky. See, the further down I bring this, the thicker the smoke gets. And while that might look kind of cool, these areas where it's wispier starts to look kind of blocky. So you can really affect that by bringing the density down a little bit. So I'm pretty happy with how that smoke looks, but you'll notice that we don't have any fire. Now, the fire is controlled by emission right here. And if I had carefully exported a physically accurate fire and used fuel for the fire channel, remember the fuel channel that I showed you over here in the XP cache? Now we have the option here for fuel. If I had used fuel, I could type in fuel, but the problem is that there just isn't very much fuel. If I go back to the beginning, maybe you'll see some. Yeah, there's a tiny bit of fuel there. It's showing as orange on the viewport. Anyway, oops. That helps if you type it right. There you go. There's your fuel. And it's kind of not very believable that that little bit of fuel will be generating that much smoke. So I'm going to go ahead and use something else. I'm going to use the heat channel. Now, the heat channel seems to correspond pretty closely to the density channel. That's okay. But if we're going for photorealistic smoke here, we don't want the whole thing to be white. So one of the things I need to do here is come in and, again, thin out the explosion. So if I bring in this max, you can see the more that I adjust this, the less white there is. But of course, fire isn't white, although if this was a black and white shot, we could just tweak the color on these two lights, and I mean, we're done. But no, what I want to do is load a preset here, and this is one of my favorite presets. It seems to come with Cinema 4D. So I'm just going to grab Flame 1. And this still is not quite physically accurate, but we are getting somewhere. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up this white, because I really do like the look of the white. And I'm actually going to come to my color picker and desaturate it even more. And you know what? Let's go ahead and bring this back down. It's more like it. Now you're wondering, how am I going to get it so that this area isn't still glowing? Essentially, to do that in Redshift, we're going to need to shift the red. I spent a lot of time thinking that one up, guys. Now we can bring in this black here. We start to see, a lot of this is just going to be eyeballing, so you can see I'm kind of struggling here, but as we do this, we start to get less glowing in the upper part of the smoke here. So bring in this black just a little bit more. Bring up our intensity so we get more of that white down at the bottom there. And this is starting to look okay. Let's go ahead a little bit later in the timeline. As you can see, there's a bunch of smoke here. There's not a bunch of red. So maybe we do want earlier for there to be more fire. But by around here, you're starting to look like that. I'm pretty happy with how that looks. Now, another problem is that we're just absorbing too much. Absorption is basically sucking the light right out of here. Now, you're looking at this and you're like, this looks like a cartoon explosion. That's because we do have to tweak a couple of settings in the renderer itself. Namely, we need to turn on global illumination. So I'm going to set our primary GI engine to brute force, and as soon as I do that, you start to see that the fire is now like physically affecting its surroundings. So we'll turn the second one here to irradiance point cloud, and then the other thing I'm going to do is switch over to bucket rendering mode, just because it's going to render a little bit quicker in this particular instance. So this is starting to look good. If we want to get rid of some of these fireflies, some of this noise, we can set this up to something like 256. And it's still a little bit noisy, but it's also rendering nice and fast. And that is starting to look much more realistic, and you're kind of getting that fall off of the brighter parts of the explosion into the smoke. So we can actually bring our scale down a little bit here. And now you're starting to see something that looks fairly realistic. I don't like how much red there is. I've never been a big fan of red, so we'll keep shifting the red. It's a little bit more like it. Maybe tweak the color picker here. Just bring the brightness down. Actually, I am going to bring the saturation down here just a little bit more. Now, as you can see, we've got some photorealistic smoke. So now I'm going to go ahead and create a camera, and we'll make it a Redshift camera. We'll look through it. And another thing that I like to do when I'm shooting smoke is be far away, because if I were taking a picture of an explosion, I wouldn't want to be standing close enough to use a 28mm lens. I'd want to be, at least a 90mm lens away. Units of measurement, a 90mm lens, yeah. All right, so I'm mostly liking how this looks. Now, if you were to try to render this out, you might want to go, oh, we've accidentally lowered this again. We'll go ahead and set this to 512. You can see it's still rendering crazy fast. I mean, even compared to, if you look at the Octane tutorial I recently did, it's rendering very, very fast. So that's a little bit noisy. You might want to play with that a little more to get rid of some of that noise. But in essence, we're done here. The only other thing I want to point out is that in Octane, you have an ability to get kind of a flare and a glow, and there are other tutorials on how to do this, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. But if you use the AOVs here, AOVs are essentially multipass, and we'll go ahead and turn multipass on, but AOVs allow you to separate different parts of the image. So I'm going to add a volume emission pass, and there are a few different ways to add these. Again, there are other tutorials on this, but if I add a volume fog emission, and I make sure that my IPR is set to bucket mode, I can come over here to volume fog emission, and now I'm just getting this fire. That's the only thing that's on here. So I could export this as like an OpenEXR, save it as a an OpenEXR file, and then I could bring this into some sort of compositing software like After Effects or Fusion, and just use this channel to create a glow effect. I mean, you could also just render a glow effect based off of the beauty channel, but if you're looking to only make the fire glow so that the smoke doesn't end up glowing, having this volume fog emission channel can be really handy. And the great thing about AOVs is you can get as fancy as you want with them. You know, you can also add all kinds of other passes in here. But if all you're looking to do is make one final tweak in post, just throwing in a volume fog emission and then using that to create a glow or a flare using your favorite compositing engine, that can be a really nifty trick. Okay, everyone, as before, there's a C4D file in the description below so that you can use that as a jumping off point. If you found this video helpful, I would appreciate if you could give it a like, maybe a comment, maybe show me something awesome that you created using some of the techniques in this tutorial or the last one. And last of all, consider following. I'm planning to create more tutorials in the future. Thanks for watching.